There are things that a man inherits without knowing the weight they carry. Billy Thompson walked along the dusty road that led to the small ranch where he was born, where he grew up, and where his grandfather had departed this life 3 days earlier. The funeral was simple, like the whole existence of old Samuel Thompson. Some townspeople, the local pastor, and Billy, the only relative left in the world. The afternoon sun battered his back through his faded shirt, and dust clung to his sweaty skin, mixing with something that could be sweat or tears. The ranch seemed smaller now, more abandoned. The fence boards groaned in the dry wind, and the wooden house showed signs of decades of fighting the elements. Billy pushed open the front door, feeling the familiar creak of hinges that have never oiled. Inside, everything remained as Samuel left it, simple, clean, and loaded with memories that now belonged only to Billy. On the kitchen table, he found a letter written in his grandfather's trembling handwriting. Few words, direct as man has always been. Billy, there's not much to leave. The house, some tools, and my old saddle. Take good care of it. It has more value than it seems. That was all. No sentimentality, no grandiose declarations of love. Just the naked truth, as Samuel always preferred. Billy walked to the small barn at the back of the property. The smell of old hay and leather mingled in the sultry air. There it was, hanging from an iron hook on the wall. Samuel Thompson's saddle. The leather was cracked by time and use, patched together in several places with pieces of different material. The buckles had long since lost their luster, and the horn was worn down by the touch of decades of calloused hands. To any observer, that saddle was worth no more than a few dollars in a thrift store. Billy ran his fingers over the rough surface, remembering the times when, as a boy, he watched his grandfather carefully prepare it before each trip. Samuel treated that saddle with a reverence that Billy never fully understood. Now looking at her, she felt only the weight of an inheritance that seemed more like a burden than a gift. He decided to take her home that same afternoon. He put the saddle over his shoulder and began the walk back along the main road. The weight was greater than he expected, and the old leather creaked with every step. He did not immediately notice the 2 men on horseback who appeared at the bend in the road, watching him with unusual interest. They didn't come closer, but Billy felt their gazes like an itch between his shoulder blades. When he turned to look, the men quickly diverted their horses to a side path, disappearing among the sparse trees. A shiver ran down her spine, despite the oppressive afternoon heat. There was something about those looks that didn't match casual curiosity. He arrived home as the sun was about to disappear behind the distant mountains. He placed the saddle in the back room, leaning against the wall. He prepared a simple meal and tried to sleep, but sleep did not come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the 2 strangers on the road, and heard again his grandfather's words, "It has more value than it appears." The next morning, Billy woke up to the sound of hooves in the backyard. He peeked out the window and saw 3 mounted men, different from those of the previous afternoon. They wore travelers' clothes, but there was something about their movements that suggested familiarity with dangerous situations. The leader, a tall man in a black hat, dismounted and approached the door. The beat was firm but not aggressive. Billy opened it, keeping his hand close to the handle of the knife he carried on his belt. The man in the black hat smiled, but the smile didn't reach his cold eyes. What they wanted, Billy would soon find out. What he didn't know was that his peaceful life had just come to an end, and that his grandfather's old saddle kept secrets capable of arousing the greed of the most dangerous men in the territory. The man in the black hat spoke with the calm voice of someone who was used to being obeyed. He said that he had known Samuel Thompson many years ago, that he respected the old man, and that he knew that Billy had inherited some things. He asked specifically about the saddle. Billy felt a knot in his stomach, but kept his face impassive. He said yes, there was an old saddle, but it was worth nothing. The man smiled again, in that way that didn't reach the eye. He said that sometimes old things have sentimental value, that he would be willing to pay a fair price for it. Billy replied that the saddle was not for sale. The silence that followed was heavy as the air before a storm. The other 2 men remained mounted, but Billy noticed how his hands rested next to the guns. The leader nodded slowly, as if he had received exactly the answer he expected. He said he respected Billy's decision, but that he might change his mind in the next few days. He mounted his horse, and the 3 of them set off, raising a cloud of red dust. Billy stood in the doorway until they disappeared completely. His heart was pounding, and his hands were shaking slightly. He closed the door and ran to the back room. The saddle was right where you left it, leaning against the wall. For the first time he examined it with real attention. The leather was more worn than he remembered. There were patches everywhere, some clearly made by Samuel himself over the years. Billy ran his fingers through the seams, feeling the irregularities. At some points the leather felt thicker, as if there was something underneath. He always thought they were just reinforcements, but now he wasn't so sure. He took a small knife and began to examine the spots where the seams looked newest. He didn't want to damage the saddle, but he needed to understand why armed men were interested in it. On one of the sides he found a seam that was definitely not original. The thread was slightly different colored, and the stitches were more irregular. He carefully cut some wires. The leather opened, revealing a small cavity. Billy pushed the edges away and saw something that made his heart stop for a moment. A piece of yellow metal shone in the dim light of the room. Gold. A small bar of pure gold, about the size of 2 fingers. Billy's hands trembled as he picked up the bar. It was heavy, solid, real. He examined the rest of the saddle with fresh eyes. How many other hiding places were there? He began to systematically palpate each section, looking for other irregularities. He found 3 more suspicious points. The second cavity revealed another slightly smaller bar. The third contained 2 smaller bars. The fourth hid a single bar, the largest of all. Billy lined up the 5 bars on the kitchen table, hardly believing his eyes. They represented more money than he had seen in his entire life. Samuel never showed wealth. He lived simply, almost poorly. Where did that gold come from? Billy remembered the stories his grandfather told him about his youth, about the trips he made through the territory before settling on the ranch. They always seemed like stories of an old man trying to impress a boy, but perhaps there was more truth to them than Billy realized. The sound of hooves echoed again in the backyard. Billy felt the blood run cold in his veins. He quickly hid the gold bars in an old pot in the kitchen cabinet and ran to the window. They were the same 3 men as before, but this time they didn't come alone. 4 more horsemen accompanied them. Billy understood that his situation had changed drastically. Those men weren't going to take no for an answer, and now he knew why they wanted Grandfather Samuel's saddle so badly. The question was, how did they know about gold? And most importantly, what were they willing to do to achieve it? The man in the black hat dismounted again, but this time he didn't come alone. 2 of the new men escorted him to the door. The beat was stronger, more insistent. Billy knew he couldn't pretend not to be home. He took a deep breath, checked if the knife was in place, and opened the door. The man's smile had completely disappeared. Now his eyes showed the coldness of someone who had lost his temper. He said that he had thought about the conversation of the morning, that perhaps he had not been clear about the importance of the saddle, that certain things were greater than sentimentality, and that Billy was too young to understand the real value of what he owned. Billy felt the danger in the air, as if he could touch it. He knew that the next few minutes would determine whether he would get out of that situation alive. The gold he discovered was real, but it might be the last thing he would ever see. Billy looked into the eyes of the man in the black hat and saw death waiting for an excuse. There was no more room for games or lies. The man knew about gold, and Billy knew he knew. The only question was how much time he had left. The leader entered the house uninvited, followed by his 2 companions. The other 4 remained mounted in the backyard, surrounding the property. Billy stepped back slowly, keeping his hands in sight but close to the knife on his belt. The man walked straight to the back room, as if he knew the place. He stopped in front of the patched saddle and ran his fingers through the open seams Billy had cut. He turned around with a cruel smile. He said that Billy had found at least part of the treasure, but that he was foolish to think that he could keep it. That gold did not belong to Samuel Thompson, never did. Billy felt the confusion mingle with fear. He asked whose gold it was then. The man laughed, a sound as rough as scraping stones. He said that 20 years ago Samuel was part of a group that robbed a stagecoach loaded with gold from the mines of California, that there was betrayal among the thieves, deaths, and Samuel fled with his share and then some. The revelation hit Billy like a punch in the gut. Samuel, the grandfather who raised him with honesty and hard work, had been a thief. The man continued, explaining that he was Jack Morrison, the only original survivor of the group, that he spent years looking for Samuel and the stolen gold, that he knew that the old man had hidden the fortune somewhere. Morrison said he tried many times to find the hiding place, which even broke the ranch house looking for, but never imagined Samuel would be smart enough to sew the gold inside his own saddle. That he only found out when one of the men who worked at the funeral mentioned how Billy had taken the old saddle very carefully. Billy tried to process everything. If the gold was really stolen, perhaps he had no right to keep it. But Morrison and his men were murderers. That was clear from the cold looks and the weapons always at hand. To give them the gold would be to fuel more violence and death. Morrison lost his temper. He ordered Billy to bring the bars he had taken from the saddle. Billy said he didn't know what he was talking about. One of the henchmen stepped forward, pulling out a gun. Morrison motioned for him to wait, but the warning was given. Billy knew he had only one chance. The pot with the gold was in the kitchen, but between her and him there were 3 armed men. He needed a distraction, something that would give him a few seconds of advantage. He looked out the window and saw that the sun was setting, creating long shadows inside the house. He told Morrison that the gold was hidden in the barn, that he had taken the bars there after finding them. Morrison narrowed his eyes, suspicious, but waved for Billy to get ahead. It was exactly what Billy expected. In the backyard, he would have more room to move, and the mounted men could not shoot without risk of hitting Morrison. They walked toward the barn, Billy in front, Morrison close behind, and the 2 henchmen flanking. The low sun created a labyrinth of shadows between the buildings. Billy silently prayed for an opportunity, for a second of carelessness that he could use to save his life. They arrived at the door of the barn. Billy pushed it slowly, the creak of the wood echoing in the tense silence. Inside, only old tools, dusty hay, and deep shadows. Morrison realized the lie immediately. His voice was cutting as he ordered Billy to turn around. Billy obeyed, but as he turned around, he took advantage of the movement to pull the knife from his belt. It wasn't a gun that could stand up to 4 revolvers, but it was better than dying empty-handed. Morrison laughed, but there was respect in his eyes. He said that Billy had courage, that it was a shame to have to kill him. It was then that the sound of hooves arrived from the main road. Many hulls. Morrison and his men instinctively turned their heads in the direction of the sound. Billy saw the chance he needed and didn't hesitate. What happened in the next few seconds would decide whether to live to see another dawn. The dust kicked up by the approaching horses created a golden curtain in the evening air. Billy held the knife tighter and prepared to fight for his life. Fate had arrived at Samuel Thompson's ranch, and he would not leave without taking something with him. The dust settled, revealing 6 mounted men, all wearing sheriff's badges. Billy felt a mixture of relief and new concern. Morrison and his henchmen put down their guns, but their faces showed irritation, not fear. There was something wrong in that situation. The sheriff dismounted and walked towards the group. He was a tall man with a grey mustache and a tired look. Billy expected him to arrest Morrison and his men, but instead the sheriff waved as if they were old acquaintances. Morrison smiled and put the gun away completely. The sheriff introduced himself as Tom Bradley of the town of Red Rock. He said he received information about suspicious activity at the Thompson ranch and came to investigate. She looked at Billy suspiciously, as if he were the criminal in the situation. Billy felt his stomach sink as he realized that Morrison had prepared everything in advance. Morrison told the sheriff a distorted version of the facts. He said that Billy had found stolen gold on the property and was trying to flee with it, that they were bounty hunters hired to retrieve the stolen treasure. He showed papers that looked official, documents that Bradley quickly examined before returning them. Billy tried to tell the truth, but Morrison interrupted him by saying that thieves always lied when they were caught, that Samuel Thompson was known in the region as a man of dubious past, and that it was no surprise that he had left stolen goods for his grandson. Bradley nodded, clearly believing Morrison's version. The sheriff ordered Billy to hand over the gold immediately. Billy knew he was lost. Even if he told the whole truth, who would believe him against men with apparently official documents? And even if the gold was actually stolen, giving it to Morrison would be giving a gun to assassins. Billy said he needed to get the bars indoors. Morrison waved to 2 of his men to accompany him. They walked back to the house, and Billy knew that this was probably his last chance to escape. Once he delivered the gold, there would be no reason for Morrison to keep it alive. Inside the kitchen, Billy went to the cupboard where he hid the pot. His hands trembled as he took out the 5 gold bars. Morrison examined them with satisfaction, weighing them in his hands as if they were newborn babies. He said that finally, after 20 years, justice was being done. It was then that Billy noticed something in the documents Morrison had shown the sheriff. While Morrison was distracted by the gold, Billy was able to get a better look at the papers on the table. The dates were wrong. The documents talked about a robbery that took place 10 years ago, not 20. Morrison had lied about everything. Billy realized that Morrison was not an original member of any group. It was just a common thief who had found out about the gold through some source and made up the whole story. But this discovery did not change his situation. Morrison still had gunmen and a corrupt sheriff on his side. The group left the house, Morrison carrying a bag of gold. Billy walked through the armed men, feeling like a convict going to the gallows. Sheriff Bradley said Billy would be taken to Red Rock to answer for receiving stolen goods. Morrison smiled, knowing that Billy would never make it to town alive. They mounted Billy on his own horse, but with his hands tied. Morrison and his men prepared to leave, taking both Billy and the gold. The sheriff and his deputies would escort them to the property boundaries, where they would supposedly part ways. As they rode on, Billy tried to think of some form of escape. The sun was almost completely setting, and soon it would be night. In the darkness, maybe he would have a chance even with his hands tied, but first he needed to survive until then. That's when he realized they weren't following the main road. Morrison had swerved onto a back trail that led into the mountains. Billy knew that this path ended in a secluded canyon, far from any witnesses. The perfect place to get rid of someone who knew too much. Morrison rode alongside Billy for a few moments. He said that he admired the boy's courage, but that business was business. That Billy had been unlucky to inherit something that didn't belong to him, and that sometimes fate was cruel to the innocent. Billy looked at the man who was going to kill him and made a decision. If he was going to die, at least he would die trying to fight. He began discreetly working on the ropes that bound his hands, using the movement of the horse to disguise his efforts. The rope was tight, but not impossible to loosen. The gorge was approaching, and with it the end of the line. Billy knew he had only a few more minutes before Morrison decided they had gone far enough from civilization. The ropes in his hands began to give way slightly. Maybe there was still a chance, however small. The moon began to appear between the clouds, casting silver shadows on the rocky path. Billy took a deep breath, preparing for what could be the last gamble of his life. Samuel Thompson's gold had brought death and betrayal, but perhaps there was still a chance for justice on that cold mountain night. The canyon opened up before them like the mouth of some giant creature. Walls of rock rose on either side, creating eerie echoes with the sound of horses' hooves. The full moon illuminated the path with a cold, silvery light, turning the shadows into menacing shapes. Billy managed to loosen the strings a little more. His hands were almost free, but he needed to choose the right moment. Morrison rode ahead of him, the bag with the gold strapped to the side of the saddle. Sheriff Bradley and his men had stopped at the entrance to the canyon as agreed. From that point on, Billy was alone with Morrison and his 4 henchmen. The silence was broken only by the echo of the hooves and the wind that whistled between the rocks. Morrison raised his hand, signaling for them to stop. They had reached the bottom of the canyon, a place surrounded by high walls and no way out, the perfect place for a murder. Morrison dismounted and walked over to Billy. He said that the time had come to end that business. That Billy had been brave, but that courage did not pay debts or return stolen gold. One of his men pulled out his gun, preparing to carry out the order that was to come. It was at that moment that Billy completely freed his hands. In one swift motion, he threw himself to the side, rolled to the ground, and hid behind a large rock. The shots echoed through the canyon like thunder, causing the horses to neigh nervously. Billy ran in a zigzag pattern, using the rocks for protection. Morrison shouted orders to his men. 2 of them dismounted to chase Billy on foot, while the other 2 remained mounted to block any escape attempt. Billy had known this place since he was a child. Samuel took him there to hunt rabbits, and he knew of every stone, every narrow passage between the rocks. He climbed a ledge in the canyon wall, moving like a shadow in the moonlight. From up there, he could see Morrison and his men looking for him. The thief was furious, screaming that Billy was only delaying the inevitable, that there was no way out of that place, that he would die there anyway. Billy waited for one of the men to pass right under the ledge. He jumped on him, knocking him down and grabbing his gun before he could react. The man hit his head on a rock and was knocked unconscious. Now Billy had a real fighting chance. The ensuing firefight echoed through the mountains. Billy used his advantage of knowing the terrain, appearing and disappearing among the rocks, shooting and changing positions before they could locate him. He managed to hit another of the henchmen in the leg, putting him out of combat. Morrison realized that he had underestimated Billy. He shouted to the remaining men to regroup, that they would leave with the gold and return with more people to finish the job. But Billy couldn't allow them to get away. That gold, stolen or not, had cost a lot. It had cost Samuel his peace. It cost him his own quiet life, and now it would cost even more if it came into Morrison's hands. Billy climbed down from the rocks and faced the 3 remaining men in the open field. The moon lit up everything as if it were a stage, and the final confrontation began. Morrison was an experienced marksman, but Billy had the advantage of youth and despair. Shots flew from both sides, sparks sprouting from the rocks where the bullets ricocheted. One of Morrison's henchmen fell hit in the chest. Another received a bullet in the shoulder and dropped the gun, moaning in pain. Only Morrison remained, who was low on ammunition and very angry. He took shelter behind his horse, using the animal as a shield. Billy circled slowly, trying to get a shooting angle. Morrison shouted that he could still make a deal, that he would split the gold 50-50, that there was no reason for them to continue killing each other because of yellow metal. Billy didn't answer. He knew that Morrison would lie until the last second, and that any deal would be a trap. The final confrontation took place when Morrison tried to get to his horse to get away. Billy came out from behind the rock at the same moment, and the 2 men faced each other from 15 paces apart. The moon was just above them, illuminating everything with a ghostly clarity. Morrison served first, but Billy was more accurate. Billy's shot hit Morrison in the chest, knocking him back over the rocks. The thief tried to get up but couldn't. She looked at Billy with a mixture of surprise and respect, as if she were finally seeing the young man as he really was. Morrison said in a weak voice that Billy had learned his grandfather's lessons well, that Samuel would be proud. Then he closed his eyes and didn't move any more. Silence descended over the canyon like a heavy blanket. Billy stood still for a long time, taking in what had happened. He had killed a man. Several men, in fact. Even if it was in self-defense, even if Morrison was a thief and murderer, reality weighed on his conscience like a stone in his stomach. He examined the wounded. 2 were dead, 2 were still breathing but needed medical attention. Billy took the bag with the gold and weapons of the fallen men. He mounted Morrison's horse, a strong animal that could carry everything to the city. The return trip was long and silent. Billy had time to think about everything he had discovered about Samuel, about himself, and about the weight of the choices a man makes in life. The gold tinkled softly in the bag, constantly reminding him of the responsibility he now carried. When he arrived in the town of Red Rock, he went straight to the federal sheriff's office, not the place. He told the whole story to the officer, showing the gold bars and explaining about Bradley's corruption. The ensuing investigation revealed that Morrison had killed at least 5 people in his search for the gold, and that Bradley had been paid to turn a blind eye. The gold was considered government property, part of a shipment stolen years ago from a federal stagecoach. Billy received a substantial reward for his recovery and the capture of the criminals. It wasn't all the fortune that the bars represented, but it was enough money to start a new life. Billy used some of the bounty to renovate his grandfather's ranch and buy cattle. He used another part to help the families of Morrison's victims. The rest he saved for the future, for the children he might have one day. Children to whom he would tell the truth about Samuel Thompson, that he had been a complicated man, with a dark past, but who in the end had tried to do right. The old saddle hung on the wall of the living room, now without its hidden secrets. Billy would look at her sometimes and think about how the things we inherit carry the weight of all the choices that came before us. Samuel had stolen that gold, but he had also chosen not to spend it, not to live off the ill-gotten wealth. He had kept it all, perhaps waiting for a moment to return it, or perhaps just carrying the guilt until the day he died. Billy learned that the true inheritance lay not in the gold sewn into the saddle, but in the hard lessons about choice and consequence. That sometimes life puts us in situations where there are no easy answers, where each path has its price, and that the most important thing is not to avoid these situations, but to have the courage to face them when they arrive. Years later, when other people asked about those violent days, Billy replied that sometimes a man inherits more than he expects, and that the real test is not what you get, but what you do with it. The old saddle on the wall was a constant reminder that even the best-kept secrets eventually come to light, and that when they do, you discover who you really are. The Thompson Ranch thrived under Billy's care. He married a city teacher, had 3 children, and lived a long and respected life. He never had to take up arms again, never again faced men like Morrison, but he carried forever the certainty that when necessary, he had the courage to do what was right, no matter the price. And on the silent desert nights, when the wind creaked the house and the shadows danced on the walls, Billy sometimes heard the distant echo of hooves in the yard and remembered that some heirlooms are heavier than gold and more valuable than any hidden treasure. If this story of courage and survival has touched your heart, You can't miss our upcoming adventures in the American Wild West. Subscribe to the channel and leave your comment below telling us what was the most exciting moment in this story for you. The discovery of the gold in the saddle, the final showdown in the canyon, or the revelation about Samuel Thompson's past.